The views and opinions expressed in this interview are protected by Section 2 of the Canadian Charter of Rights and Freedoms, which affirms the freedom of conscience, thought, belief, opinion, and expression, including freedom of the press and other media of communication. If you seek the official narrative on the COVID-19 pandemic, go to the Health Canada website. With that said, if you seek the repressed truth, stay tuned for our interview. Hello, Dr. Sam Dubé here once more for the Toronto Business Journal. And our guest today is Ethan Yang. Ethan is a research fellow for the American Institute for Economic Research. He is also the director of the Mark Twain Center for the Study of Human Freedom at Trinity College. And he's held research positions at the Cato Institute. Did I say that correctly? The Connecticut State Senate, Cause of Action Institute, and several other organizations. You also run the podcast for the American Institute for Economic Research, and that's known as Authors Corner. And finally, you're working on your doctorate of jurisprudence. So congratulations on that. It's going to be a long haul for you, but it'll be worth it in the end. So thank you, Ethan, for coming on to our show.
Yeah, Sam, it's great to be here.
Awesome. Now, Ethan, I stumbled across an article of yours written for AIER, and that was back in May. And it was an article concerning the censorship of Canadian physicians. Canadian doctors are being censored. And you actually quoted the Soviet dissident, Nathan Sharansky, who had stated that to be a loyal Soviet citizen was to say what you're supposed to say, to read what you're permitted to read, and to vote the way you're supposed to vote, and to know it was all a lie. And that really, struck me. And I knew you were someone I wanted to interview. So could you please speak to the censoring, starting perhaps with the letter that you had come across by the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario to its members regarding the pandemic response?
So I first came across that letter when there's an economics professor in Canada, I forgot his name, but he actually alerted AIER to what's going on, because we have been covering these issues for a while and have been putting out a lot of research and a lot of counter narratives to what's been going around these days. So that's kind of how I came across it at first. Obviously, I read it and I was absolutely horrified to know that there is a licensing body, a professional licensing body in Canada of all places. This could have been China or Russia for all we knew, but it was in Canada, one of the more freer countries in the world. And they're censoring doctors and physicians and surgeons who decide to speak out against not just basic stuff, like maybe they're talking about vaccines in the way that they didn't like, or maybe they're talking about lockdowns in the way they didn't like, but any sort of position that the state maintains was basically banned. You're not allowed to speak out against state policy, which is that's textbook censorship, and I think is absolutely horrifying.
I would encourage our viewers to check out the AIER website with your article, as I have titled it there, and you can see the quote from that letter and the CPSO's response as well. So I guess my question to you is this going to lead us, or potentially lead us, into a type of, Soviet style regime in terms of the restrictions on free speech and maybe even free action? That's a big question, but I'd love to hear your thoughts. Please, Ethan.
Yeah, so I think we need to start out with the idea of censorship itself, and this idea of having an orthodoxy about how to think and how to act when it comes to COVID. And many people would say that, this is the 21st century, we have all these very smart doctors, we have very smart people in the government, and we can essentially, we know it's right, and if you disagree with us, then you're wrong, and you're holding back progress, and your people are dying because of your incorrect opinions. And people would say that, we have these things because we're so intelligent and we're so innovative. But I think this really goes back, this idea of having orthodoxy and censorship is not new. It goes back as far as anyone can really imagine the history of humanity going back, of having, correct and incorrect opinion, of putting some sort of larger goal over the rights of individuals themselves. This idea is nothing new. These people like to say that we are an enlightened people, we live in an enlightened age, but in reality, the idea of free speech and free dialogue and discourse and the scientific method itself is a recent innovation. And it's an innovation that we fought long and hard for, and it's an innovation worth defending. And so when people talk about how, you're just enabling all sorts of terrible things, and we are just so smart and we can stop this, they're really taking a step backward and not a step forward. So I think that's my one major point, is that the idea of censorship itself, this putting a political cause over people's individual rights and the truth, is an idea that's really inherent to our human nature itself. It's something we should be careful of. And I think it's a really great thing that, for at least the time being, that we've been able to restrain it for this long.
So why did they come out with this statement? And you talked about political motivation. How did this happen, Ethan, given your background in political science and in law?
Mm-hmm. So I don't really know what's going on the ground in Canada. I'm assuming that obviously the government has its narrative, it has its policy platform. They want to do their lockdowns, they want to do their vaccination program. They want to do all sorts of stuff that a lot of people justifiably were opposed to. People did not like being locked down. People did not like the government getting into every single part of their lives. I think I read specifically that the physicians, for example, when it came to closing down basketball courts, the physicians were saying, wait a minute, like, closing down basketball courts is A, not going to stop the spread of the virus, and two, it's going to make people less healthy because now they can't go out and exercise. And so as physicians, it is our duty actually to inform not only our patients that you should probably go out and exercise, but also tell the government that that's wrong, right? So there's a fundamental mismatch between what the government thought, this narrative the government is telling itself, that we can control everything, we can close down society, there will be no consequences, everything will be fine, and if you disagree with us, you're killing people. And what independent thinking and critical thinking physicians and surgeons and doctors were looking at, and they're looking at the evidence, they're coming up with their own conclusions and trying to follow their oath, which is to basically follow the evidence and support their patients. And there was a fundamental mismatch between essentially politics and free thinking, critical thinking people.
Exactly. And you hit it on the head when you mentioned the informed consent. So the two basic mantras for any physician that should take priority over everything else is the idea of doing no harm and informed consent for your patients and the populace. And this statement by the College of Physicians and Surgeons of Ontario seems to contradict that, seems to, in fact, to go completely against that. Another aspect that you spoke about was how this contradicts science, the scientific spirit, the scientific method, and that we have to be open to debate. We have to be open to falsification. We have to be open to discussion. And the buck stops there, it's like they're not allowing this. And this is very congruent with Fauci, his statement that if you go against Dr. Anthony Fauci, you're going against science. And I just found that statement to be profoundly arrogant, because it's become very clear over time that he's flip-flopping, and that many of his statements are made either knowing that he's not telling the truth, or he just doesn't simply know the science. And to associate science, a method, it should be repeatable anywhere in the universe, right? The method with a person is just profoundly arrogant. And what do you have to say to that, Ethan?
Yeah, I don't have a background in medicine, but I can tell you it's probably not what you're supposed to be doing. But back to the scientific method and this idea of falsifiability, doctors are supposed to be debating, and you're supposed to have ideas coming and clashing against each other, and you're supposed to see what idea comes out in the end. If you basically appoint one person as essentially a deity of correct thought, none of this happens, and you don't really have a medical practice at that point. You just have an ecclesiarchy. It's basically, we're returning to the days of pre-Enlightenment days where the church said what was right and wrong, and they basically burned doctors at the stake, right? So yeah, this is why I think it's a huge point that we need to reiterate that censorship and these orthodoxies are not recent innovations. They're what we tried to escape from through the Enlightenment, through things like free speech, through the institutions of democracy and liberal democracy for that matter. So this idea, I think, like I said, I think it's based in human nature. We've been like this for thousands of years, and we've escaped for it for at least a couple, maybe like past 200 years. We've been trying to escape from that. But yeah, I think it's natural to our human nature to want to essentially appoint a deity and bow to him. But it's not productive. It's not. That's why science became a thing. That's why Galileo Galilei was persecuted for saying that the Earth revolved around the sun and not the other way around. That's how we used to be. And I think we're tiptoeing back in that direction where, Fauci says that the medicine and virus works one way. Doctors are saying, oh, I don't think that's correct. And they're getting persecuted for it.
And doctors and other healthcare practitioners and nurses have been coming out as well, because they're frontline and they're seeing exactly what's happening clinically, and they're questioning. And the training you receive as a physician is to operate independently as islands, to have that ability to discern and scrutinize the available evidence. And when you're just being told something and told to accept it no matter what, when you're receiving evidence to the contrary, and it's so blatant when you're witnessing these side effects among your patients, and you know that I brainchild and hosted a panel with 4 physicians who express concern and dissent regarding the public health response to the pandemic, as well as questioning the injections. And they even had legal representation there on the panel, and they were being persecuted in no uncertain terms by their provincial governing bodies in a way that was horrific. And the last 12 minutes of that video basically was a recording of this so-called meeting where they're firing Dr. Francis Christian for expressing this dissent. And it's unbelievable that this is happening now, here and now, but it just goes against the whole idea of what physicians are trained to do. And again, we go back to the idea of doing no harm and informed consent. So my esteemed colleague and friend, Dr. Roger Hodkinson, stated it really is choosing income over ethics. And he has a way of being very profound and black and white, what do you say to that? And then where do we proceed from here, Ethan? What do we do to resist this, to combat this, when the highest levels of medicine, the governing bodies, the policing bodies who are supposed to be protecting the patients, are no longer protecting the patients? Maybe from their perspective, they are. Maybe there's some people sitting there up in the upper echelons that really truly believe that they're protected. I doubt it, because the evidence is there with the deaths and the side effects and such. But where do we go from here? How do we combat this?
So I think that's a very profound question. And I think if I knew the answer, I'd obviously be a lot more famous than I am. But I guess I can speak a little bit to that. I guess we'll start with what you said about medicine and having a bunch of different opinions and the necessity for that. Is reflected a lot in politics, especially that's kind of my background, so I can speak on that. The reason why we have a democracy and not a dictatorship is so we can have a ton of different opinions bouncing off each other. And within that market of ideas, the best ones will prevail. If we restructure our democracy to the point where, if the president says something, all you legislators got to fall in line, then if the president wants to say, I think both you revealed to me that both our parents fled communist China, for example. If Mao wants to do a cultural revolution or a great leap forward and absolutely muck up the economy and kill 65 million people, that's an example of what happens when everyone just follows the leader like ducks in a line, right? That's why we have democracies that are deliberative and gridlocked on purpose, so people can argue with each other, different ideas can cross. And if there's no consensus, then you don't move forward. If there is a consensus, it's because one idea prevailed, right? So that's why we need more debate, not less. So that's why I think it's extremely concerning that we're having this development in medicine, of all things. Like, obviously government's one thing, but the actual practice of science, and I don't want to walk into a doctor's office knowing that he's just listening to whoever up there is saying, right? He's not doing his own research. So I think that's extremely concerning. Where do we go from here? I think I guess obviously we would need political reform. I'm not confident if we can get the right people in the right places right now, but I think looking back to history, when it comes to big political change, we have seen that when the government itself gets so overbearing and people are just so fed up with their policies, then you do have radical change. And we see that from an economic perspective, I like to cite Britain and the US in the 1970s. That's when this is when in Britain, the Labour Party was becoming very powerful. They had a lot of control over the economy. In the US, There's also a lot of controls over the economy, and it just got so bad that people were so fed up that they elected people like Margaret Thatcher and Reagan. I'm not endorsing them, but
Right.
I'm saying that there's a popular backlash to bad policy. So I think that can be our light at the end of the tunnel. So I guess to reiterate, I'm not confident that, obviously I would like political change. I would like free thinking people to be in power. But if it gets too bad, then in democracies at least, there is a tendency for the people to really understand that maybe 5, 10 years later that it needs to happen, but they will, and they will rise up.
Well, lives are at stake. Lives are at stake here, Ethan. And there's evidence that if early treatment modalities had been endorsed when they were originally recognized, that we could have saved maybe even up to 80% or more of those COVID deaths. Okay. And so how much longer do we have to wait? And now the other thing, having gone through medical school and residency, I know very well that many physicians read the conclusion of studies at the most. Many are not well versed in statistics, and you can't, can you expect them to be? I have a science background. Medicine was a second career for me, and so you learn to be much more discerning. And looking at studies, just because there's a study doesn't mean it's right. And cherry picking studies, or even worse, cherry picking data. We've seen this during the pandemic. So I'm digressing a little bit here, but I think also if we look at it from the physician perspective, when we talk about consensus, what does consensus really mean? Well, science is not about consensus, right? And so you get physicians saying, oh yeah, I totally agree. But why do you agree? Well, because I read what the governing body told me to read, or they referred me to this, or they said this was debunked by this, and then they said that was debunked, and they going around in a circle. Just saying something's debunked doesn't mean it's debunked. You know what I mean? Show me the proof. Show me the source. Show me the reliability of the source. Show me the reproducibility of that study. You know what I mean? So, we're human beings. Physicians are human beings. Researchers are human beings. But originally, they could have made this argument for consensus because there may have been consensus, especially with the help of the media in trying to, go against what President Trump was saying at the time, being the first major figure to say, oh, well, the virus leaked from a lab in China. And then instantly, that's got to be a lie. And now we know. I mean, the likelihood is that, yeah, absolutely. It's not only genetically manipulated, but it leaked from a lab. Whether it's on purpose or not, we don't know yet. We may never know. But, this whole idea of consensus now has kind of fallen apart because you're getting these dissenting voices that are starting to pop up. And, my panels and interviews are one example of many. And so when are there going to be enough voices? And how much power do they really have? And looking back historically, with your background, Ethan, you just talked about political reform. That's a very broad term. What about, to start from the top with who in the US, or can we enact some reform here in Canada in our medical governing bodies at that kind of highest level of medicine without necessarily the political reform? What do you think about that?
Well, you did mention the media, so definitely say a little
Please.
bit about them, because I think they've been absolutely horrific. I think the doctors are here, right? They obviously had their issues, but the media, I feel like, took it to a whole new level about how bad things would get in terms of spreading hysteria and really beating people over the head with the common narrative. Because I think, especially you mentioned the consensus, right? I've heard that term so many times, and I'm very much on board with you in the sense that the consensus can be like whatever you want it to be. I want to listen to good arguments. I would like to see the methodology. I would like to see like the data, right? That's how it's supposed to be. And I think that's how most academic people think, right? That's like, I tend to hold myself to that standard. Like I try to stay away from the media, one, for obvious reasons, but two, for the reasons you just stated. But the media are not necessarily committed to that. A lot of times the media believe that they're in some sort of weird position to help society through some political means, right? They're essentially an arm of some sort of political philosophy. So that when they see a doctor say something that they like, they don't ask the questions that we would ask. They just say, all right, this person confirmed my narrative, so like support the consensus. So in my eyes, the media have really acted as attack dogs for this common narrative, this orthodoxy. And I think that's extremely concerning. I think everyone knows it, so I'm not too concerned at this point, right? Trust in the media is an all-time low, which is bad in many respects. Obviously, we'd like, to be on the same page, but also good because the media have misbehaved, in my opinion. So that's my spiel about the media. When it comes to reform, I think it is going to be bottom up because I think the top levels of government, for many reasons, there's like a whole political economic explanation of why the top stays the way it does. But at the bottom, at least, you can have these reforms. You can have, especially on the state level, and speaking from a U.S. perspective, there have been reforms passed on the state level, at least. I think Pennsylvania is one example of the people actually having democratic referendums and restricting the emergency powers of governors, which is one of the main powers used in the United States to pass many lockdowns. So I think we are seeing change at the bottom, and I think that's really where it's going to come from, because we've obviously seen what the top has in store for us, and it hasn't been good. They're the whole reason why all this happened in the first place.
So I think we need to tell her you're in Washington D.C. right now, and you're American, and you work with this American Institute. Here in Canada, I've mentioned this before in other podcasts that we have a liberal minority government with an official opposition who is going completely along with the official narrative, so to speak. The lockdowns, the social distancing, the implementation of the vaccines, the emergency use authorization, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera, shutting down the schools. And there's no counter narrative. We don't have the red versus the blue. The provincial powers are somewhat more limited. Our Ontario Premier, this being July 17th, 2021, to put it into temporal context, just was it yesterday or the day before, said no to vaccine passports, no way. But if our federal government decides to implement them, that may not mean anything at all. He may just be passing the buck. This is Premier Ford. So, and we just opened up yesterday to indoor dining. And so the streets were packed. I was out last night and it was a wonderful sight. And today I was going to be late for our interview because I was literally caught on the interprovincial bridge between Ontario and Quebec, and people, it was packed. It was absolutely packed. People who were hiding during the lockdowns have finally come out, and it's like it was 2 years ago again. But there's still some masking going on and such. I guess what I'm saying is there's some fundamental differences here between the U.S. Structure and the Canadian and the approach. And so our provinces don't have this kind of autonomy that the U.S. states do. I mean, look at Texas, look at Florida in terms of the mandates regarding lockdowns, and look at South Dakota and Governor Kristi Noem. I mean, I'll admit I got a crush on her. Like she doesn't take any crap, and
we all do, yeah.
Yeah. Hey, didn't mind. No, but seriously, I think she would make a fantastic president someday. But that may just be me. But anyway, she just laid it all out, and she's playing the long game, and looked at the data, and Fauci was telling her, you're going to have 10,000 hospital beds filled, and I think at the most they had 600 in South Dakota. So propaganda left, right, and center. Fauci emails showing huge discrepancies with the knowledge and the action or the statements made to the public. Just it's obscene. It really is. So I guess what I want to ask you is, knowing a lot more about government and politics than me, do you see any hope for us here in Canada? Honestly, I want to bring it back to Canada here, Ethan, if you can comment to that, please.
I believe the U.S. is so open. There's two reasons why. Obviously, we had a counter narrative. Obviously, DeSantis and the governor of Texas, Abbott, opened up their states, and that showed everyone else, like, hey, they opened up, they're not dying. Let's open up too. So I think that's the importance of a counter narrative, right? Without counterfactuals, you cannot really confirm your idea is correct. And obviously, Texas and Florida served as the opposite of what was going on, and it showed that opening up is fine, right? So that's one thing. Obviously, I don't know if Canada can do that itself. But I would also contend to a lot of my colleagues who would say that the U.S. is so great and we are pro-freedom, that a lot of the states are also opening up just because of the vaccine rollout. I don't think people are. I feel like that's also been the plan the whole time, is a lockdown until there's a vaccine. So I wouldn't even grant us that much credit when it comes to really sticking to like the intellectual rigor of are lockdowns good or bad. I think DeSantis is obviously an outlier, and also Kristi Noem. I think they're outliers. They're very much on board with it to begin with. But I think a lot of people are just opening up because one, they're seeing it's working, but also two, there's a vaccine rollout. They can claim, they can basically punt responsibility to that. So that's why I'm not too optimistic. But at the same time, you said that, you know, they opened up in Canada and everyone's out and about, everyone's happy, and no one's dying. And I think that that might show as a proof of concept to the rest of Canada, because I think people do want to get back to their lives, right? And if they see that it's happening, then you might have something.
We're I believe the last province to really open up. Alberta opened up before our big national holiday, July 1st. That's the equivalent of your July 4th, our Canada Day. And so July 1st here in the nation's capital, where I was used to going, downtown Ottawa, where in the downtown environs, you'd have 500,000 people congregating and up to 100,000 around Parliament Hill alone to watch fireworks. It's just incredible. And it makes you proud to be Canadian. You know, we had nothing like that. Now, there was a few spots where people fired off fireworks, and I guess, I don't think there was any legal, you know, they weren't doing it illegally or anything, but I mean, some people put up some professional fireworks and stuff, but it was kind of sad that they chose not to allow us to have that Canada Day. So, you know, I'm speaking about my province. Our lockdowns are among the strictest. And again, when it comes to politicians, Premier Pallister in Manitoba was asked, I guess, a month or two ago by a reporter, very diplomatically, very nicely, about considering ivermectin as an early treatment. He completely ignored the question, responded with something about maybe we can make vaccines here in Canada. We certainly have the, you know-how and infrastructure. Thank you very much. And that was it. And after taking a sip of water and shuffling some papers nervously and looking down and walking off. And it's like, who are you working for? You know, this is a legitimate question and people want to know the answer to it, you know? And, you know, our medical bodies are not saying anything other than, well, it's dangerous and hasn't been approved. But that I'm laughing because I've seen the randomized control trials. I've seen the information, and then they go and and I'm sorry, I know this is a little bit outside of your sphere, but, you know, remdesivir is being pushed, you know, this antiviral. And it's like, how can you push something like that? And it's costing, you know, thousands of dollars to treat a patient when you have several medications that are cheap and safe and decades old, that there would be, because of this emergency use authorization, there can be no reasonable alternate treatment in order to maintain or to grant an emergency use authorization for the injections, you see. So it's pretty obvious there's political and financial motivation there. Anyway, I'm rambling because I'm passionate about this. But Ethan, you do a lot of writing about China, and both you and I being of Chinese ancestry and having this, you know, this family history of escaping the communist government. How can you relate China to what's going on here today, and more specifically to the censoring of Canadian physicians?
Yeah, I think it's really relevant today because China recently celebrated the CCP recently celebrated its 100th birthday. And there's a lot of, I wrote my articles, but I noticed that basically everyone else in the West was kind of picking up on the same idea that I was picking up on, was that they're basically, it's all smoke and mirrors, right? The CCP was broadcasting this huge show of strength, and they were saying how powerful they are and don't mess with us. But if you actually look at all of China, all the stuff going on in China, the way their policies are carrying out, the way the people themselves are really not buying into the government, they're just pretending that they believe everything. And essentially, in the words of Nathan Sharansky, again, they're living a lie, right? They're being told that everything's great, the government is so great, we are very powerful, and yet everyone understands that that the West, you know, is very rich, and they don't need to listen to the government. I think one of my colleagues taught in China, and he said that everyone in his class knows what a VPN is at this point, right? To get past the firewall. So in the sense, same thing here in the US is that you look at, like, I remember in DC, like, everyone wears masks. DC is a very like left-leaning city. But I remember one of my friends gets in an Uber one day, takes his mask off. Everyone sees him takes a mask. Everyone takes their mask off too, right? Everyone's like, oh my God, let's get these things off. And so we're all living a lie, basically. We've all accepted this lie, this narrative. And it's one, very disconcerting and very disheartening. But also, this is why I'm somewhat optimistic about the future when it comes to the resistance to these kinds of things, is no one likes to live a lie. People do not like to be told one thing and their conscience and their intuition tells them to do another thing. And so we're standing 6 feet apart, we're putting on these masks, we're doing all these crazy things. But most of us know this is silly, right? And so and I think we are seeing that people are starting to wake up. They are starting to realize that this is all very, very silly. We're basically making fools of ourselves right now. And hopefully more and more people will wake up to that. And I think that's why, much like I believe in China, that there's a growing amount of people who are just going along with the flow just because there's threats of violence if they don't. But in the reality, they understand that there's tons of problems. Like Jack Ma, for example, was recently disappeared, right? He's back now. He took up painting, allegedly. That's what the CCP said. He wanted to take a little painting trip. So Jack Ma criticized yeah, I know, looking at your facial expression. So yeah. Jack Ma, for those who are unaware, he has this really innovative, he's invested in a very innovative fintech group called Ant Group, which has it's a very innovative way of doing finance, very fancy, everyone was excited about it, right? But the problem was that it went against the CCP state banking system, right? The CCP state banking system has a ton of problems with it. And he's saying my company's great, right? Do my company, the CCP banking system sucks, which it does, he's not wrong. But the CCP didn't have it. They're like, you can't question our banking system. You're very dangerous. And so that's why he took up painting for a little bit, right? And so we're seeing this all, people are starting to wake up in China. They're saying the state banking system sucks, our protectionist economy is not good. The central planning economy is not good. The censorship sucks. We don't like it. Human rights are giving us a bad reputation abroad. But people obviously just keep it to themselves because they're afraid of getting hurt. So I think, yeah, they and also we are living a lie, and no one likes to live a lie.
But we're supposed to be in a democracy in Canada and the US. This is the fundamental ideological and practical difference. Is there any practical difference really in its in enacting the ideology? And this is what I'm wondering. Okay, you're working on your doctorate in jurisprudence. You're a legal expert in the US. Biden recently said that they're going to go knocking on doors with brown shirts to verify vaccination status. Jen Psaki, White House spokesperson, who looks disconcertingly like Mark Zuckerberg. I'm not sure about that one. But anyway, stated very quickly, and as part of a sentence, that we're working with social media to contain misinformation, something like that.
Yeah.
And yeah, I mean, an admission like that. And then I think there was an implication later about how anyone who spreads misinformation, whatever that means to them, on social media platforms should be banned from all platforms. What are the implications for this? But first of all, how can they do this, okay, and get away with the legal implications? And then can they get away with it, Ethan? And how would this be fought against if they were to start to implement something like this? Can you answer those three? Sorry,
yeah,
to heap that.
That's a really pleasant coincidence, because that's actually the topic of my current research.
Oh, fantastic.
Yeah, obviously, I guess the quick answer before I get into it, the quick answer is that no one knows, because it's a very novel territory, but I will outline the general legal theory of why I think it's a really bad idea.
Okay, just for our viewers, no, I had no idea about this. This is lucky.
Yeah, this is a very pleasant coincidence. But on your point about the practical differences of China and the US, I think obviously structurally our systems are different. I think in the US, things can go you won't get the atrocities in the US, or there's less likely of getting the atrocities in the US because we have so many limits on power. But I think back to the human nature point, that everyone, I do not think there's a single difference between humans in China versus humans in the US. And if you think so, you're a racist. That's a textbook definition of racism. We are all political. We all have these jealousies and these tendencies to dominate. It's just, do our systems contain those tendencies, right? In the US liberal democracies, we pit these tendencies against each other, and that's why we're free. It keeps the government off your back with these limits on power. In China, it's essentially their egos are unleashed, right? So I think practically, and from a structural standpoint, the US and the liberal democracies in general are different, but people-wise, the tendencies are the same, which is why we should always be skeptical. Moving on to the door-to-door stuff, Jen Psaki and Biden administration. That's actually funny because they said that, and then obviously the U.S. had a field day. Because we have guns in the U.S. I don't know about Canada, but we have a lot of guns here. So if you want to come knocking on doors, we'll come knocking right back. So
I was
so
just picturing that happening in Texas, for instance. Like, oh,
it's not happening in Texas, but but they did walk it back. Actually, they said, no, we meant to inform people about how they should get vaccinated. We're going to work. So they walked it back. Obviously, that would probably be extremely illegal. There's all sorts. Yeah, I don't like. Before we even get into the legality of that, first and foremost, you're going to start a civil war. So it's dead on arrival, as lawyers like to say. But I guess back to the media question that you're asking about, do they have the ability to work with social media companies to stamp out misinformation? I guess a quick note on misinformation, I absolutely hate that word now because it's basically a pseudonym for stuff I don't like, ideas I do not like. Disinformation, I think, still has legitimate. Disinformation is actual lies, right? Misinformation is based by even its textbook definition is ideas that can mislead people. What does it mean to mislead people where, right? Anyways, so I hate that word now. It's like
away from what they want you to know, right?
Exactly, right. Like obviously before it had some legitimacy because you can say facts to lead you to a false conclusion, right? That's what it's supposed to mean. But now it's just like it's misleading people to somewhere I don't like. But the legality of working with social media companies to stamp out misinformation, the First Amendment obviously allows social media to do it themselves, right, as private companies. But there's an exception called the state action doctrine or the non-delegation doctrine. If you can show that the state is coercing or colluding with a private entity to accomplish something that is unconstitutional, that's the private company is then considered a state actor, which must abide by the Constitution. So that's the base. So that would be the basic argument. If we can prove that Twitter, Facebook, YouTube are either colluding with the government or being coerced by the government by threat of regulation, by threat of fines, what have you, then they will not be allowed to police information the way Jen Psaki believes they can. Obviously, they can get around it by being like, oh no, like we just happen to agree that like on the same types of misinformation conveniently, right? If they can prove that, then maybe they can get away with it. But I think they're obviously, if they do that, there will be lawsuits, and those lawsuits, I think that what the crux of the lawsuits will be is, can we, through discovery, find evidence that there is collusion that the court will find to actually be collusion or coercion in the sense that they're sufficiently being coerced either through threat of regulation, through threat of sanction or whatever, to comply with the government. So that, I guess to summarize, I said a lot. Private corporations can be held to the same standards as governments in the US if there is sufficient evidence to say that they are colluding or being coerced by the government to accomplish something that is unconstitutional. So that's going to be the big crux of it, of whether or not it's legal or not.
Yeah, but what if they just come out and say, we weren't coerced, we're not colluding, we agree, like you were saying, we agree. And there's the other argument, I think, and I just thought of this. What are these entities? I mean, look at big tech, look at where we are technologically. I remember growing up and we had cassettes. We would try to download a game off a cassette. And I remember programming and missing a bracket in BASIC and going, damn, my Pong game's not going to work now, right? I mean, we've come such a long way when it comes to technology. So these entities of social media, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter, I mean, there's so many now, and then you got the search engines as well. Like, what are these things, and does the law apply to them, or do we define new entities, and is that a loophole? I don't know, because when you're talking about companies that are being they have to maintain the same strictures and laws as the government, but what are these things? And when you've got search engines and social media censoring governments, how did that even happen? You know what I mean? When your reach is global and you're censoring a nation, but by the nature of the internet, it's global. You would know far more about the legal implications than me. I just think that this is a whole new area, and applying the laws, I'm not optimistic. with
Mhm.
existing laws. And then where money is concerned and lawmakers are concerned, can new laws be made that give these new entities, companies, the benefit of the doubt, so to speak, make life easy for them, right? This is what I would be concerned about. I don't think it's cut and dry, much as I would love to see these things contested at the Supreme Court. Um, what did I want to ask you about? I thought of this. Just to switch gears for a second, and unless you have a comment to make about what I just said, I think I was being
Mhm.
fairly rhetorical there.
Sure. Yeah. I think since you want to move on, I'll just be really quickly.
No, no,
I
no.
was listening.
Please, I have you here. Talk.
Yeah, of course. So I was one of my top legal influences is Richard Epstein. He's a very famous law expert in the U.S. And his take on it was that when it comes to the power of these social media corporations and getting away with censoring, basically, former presidents and thousands of people, what have you, is that like one, there's the First Amendment claim. The whole argument I just outlined is if you can prove that they're colluding with the government, yada yada yada. There's also the text of Section 230, which is what gives them immunity from being sued for censoring and whatnot. Some people may argue that the text essentially is giving a blank check to them to do whatever they want. Uh, Professor Epstein would argue that there's some language in there because, like, first and foremost, there hasn't been really much litigation on this front because it is such a novel topic. There's text in it that it says that all this has to be done in good faith. So, what does good faith mean? Does good faith mean that you can't censor? Who knows? We haven't really had any much movement on that. But also, it was mostly to protect. It was mostly to enable social media companies to censor violence and sexual content. That was the whole intent of the law, Section 230, of the Communications Decency Act, right? And so he would argue that because the intent was to mostly censor, calls for violence and calls for and also sexual content, you can't extrapolate that. This also gives them the freedom to police, medicine, police politics, police whatever. Obviously, this is a very novel theory. I have no clue if that's going to work or not. But that's one area of contestation. On the other side, but also said if there's no First Amendment claim, which I believe there's probably not going to be one, then there's at least we can have popular backlash, right? So social media companies need to make money, right? They need to keep their customers happy, and part of that is allowing conservative and or counter narrative, what have you, like social, all the different opinions on the internet, right? If you start shutting out different opinions, then one, you're going to shut out those customers, and then all the customers who want to hear those opinions, I think, which most people would like to be in a free and open internet, are going to also get upset as well, right? So if there's no legal pressure, there can at least be social pressure, economic pressure. And I guess some governments around the world have just straight up banned Twitter. I'm not a proponent of that. I think Twitter is important. I think, social media is a lot of fun. And also, like, I don't think that's a really good legal precedent to set here. But that's also a market response in and of itself, not necessarily market in a traditional sense, but as in governments around the world are getting really irritated the way you're treating people. So they're just going to straight up ban you as well, right? So governments who have more power than our government can just basically be part of that backlash as well. I don't really have a strong opinion of where I want the internet to go. I just would like it to be free and open, obviously. But those are the two ways I think it can go. Either there's an actual legal claim on First Amendment grounds, or there is a big economic market sort of backlash against their behavior.
Okay, thank you for addressing my concerns there. I wanted to ask you, and I don't mean to put you on the spot here, but you've heard of Dr. Rainer Fulmich, right? The German-American lawyer who is launching massive class action lawsuits. He won lawsuits against, I guess, Deutsche Bank, and there was a car company. Was it Volkswagen? I can't recall, but anyway, and he won. And so he just recently interviewed Dr. David Martin, who's a patent expert and intellectual property expert, and tracing the patents for the various coronaviruses through the last 20 years. And it's very clear from that evidence that the COVID-19 is not novel. And we now have biological evidence for that as well, based on the immunoglobulin response of people exposed to COVID, IgG and IgA versus IgM. If anyone's interested, that's Dr. Sukrat Bhakdi who brought that out. It's really quite impressive and groundbreaking. But anyway, Dr. Rainer Fulmich, with his massive class action suit against the powers that be for the pandemic, what chance? I know this is a long shot question, but what's your opinion of these class action lawsuits, these global suits? We have a lawyer here in Canada, Michael Swinwood, who is also launching. You may have heard of him, and if you haven't, I apologize for bringing him up right now, but who is also launching class action suits here in Canada regarding the pandemic response. Is there any hope here, Ethan, just to put it bluntly?
That's actually a good question, because my colleague works at a big law firm here in DC that does exactly what you're doing. What they're doing is basically like pro-freedom style lawsuits. That's their specialty. And so their theory, their approach has been, during the pandemic, just the way judges act, and also the way legal doctrines intersect with emergency powers and whatnot. During the pandemic, it was a really bad idea to sue, because the judges can just claim that, the police power of the government allows during times of crisis to waive these individual rights, right? But now that the crisis is basically over, now that people are starting to calm down, now that we can start to really think clearly, and also view it in hindsight on the legal theory and not on the context. So we can actually think about, was this legal, instead of like freak out, there's a virus, right? And so that's why they've been waiting till about now. Now they've I think probably 2 months ago, maybe, they launched the class action lawsuit against the CDC for their eviction moratorium, which is the CDC, like the basic legal theory says that the Center for Disease Control cannot stop landlords from collecting rent. Like that's not how the government works. Like maybe you support like stopping landlords from collecting rent, like that's besides the point, right? The CDC does not have the power to regulate the economy. Where's to say that, right? I don't see a PhD in economics. No. Dr. Fauci, like, we're okay, whatever, right?
Yeah, exactly. No, but remember, Fauci is science.
Yeah, economic science, I guess, as well.
Yeah, I guess so. Yeah.
But yeah, I think so I guess that there is hope, in the sense that now that the pandemic is over, people are starting to calm down. You can actually bring these lawsuits to court and argue based on the legal theory and the law, instead of without the overhanging crisis ahead of you. And I also, some other legal theorists that places I've worked with, they've noticed that some things may be constitutional in the beginning. A lot, like for example, like I said, the Constitution allows the government to waive rights when there's a crisis. But when things start to calm down, the constitutionality of those policies starts to dwindle, right? You can maybe justify, when you know absolutely nothing about the virus, some more draconian policies. But when you understand that, like, the way, like the certain types of people that affects you, and like the way it spreads and whatnot, going out and walking on the sidewalk banning that might have been justified at the beginning. Obviously, I don't think so, but like legally, maybe. But like, a year in, there's no justification to stop people from walking around on the sidewalk, right? Because we just know so much at this point. So those are some areas of hope, in the sense that in the beginning, courts would have been very hostile, been very skeptical of striking things down. But now that we're all calmed down, now that we understand what worked, what didn't, and we can actually objectively look at history, look at the science, look at the policy, there is room for hope in the legal area.
It's good to hear, Ethan, because myself and many others have lost hope in the legal system. I mean, not even talking about the hope in the medical system. How can we ever go back to trusting the physicians who've towed the company line? You know what I mean? And that leads into my next question. But as I was talking earlier about how can we trust the legal system? How can we trust anyone who's helped to propagate what's essentially a false narrative, which so many people have become aware of over the last 16 odd months? And I mean, there's a trail of evidence that leads back, if Dr. David Martin is I mean, he's got a paper trail, so it's very clear, over 20 years with regards to the coronavirus and such. This is very scary. And what I wanted to ask you was about accountability. So bringing it back to the censorship of Canadian physicians, how do you hold, for instance, CPSO accountable if and when things start to become even more clear to the general public, as they are clear now to many researchers and physicians? I sit on in a couple of groups where we exchange research and information freely. And it is just so painfully obvious what the real science is saying, what's being suppressed. I don't even want to start going down that road in this interview, but and I have in others, but how do you hold a provincial governing body responsible that's supposed to be protecting patients, that's policing physicians who are dissenting from the so-called consensus that's not even based on science? Where does one even begin, Ethan?
On that end, I'm actually not too optimistic in the sense that the West is a very unique place in the sense that we do have so much accountability, we do have so much freedom. Other countries around the world have these censorships in place, have these, and they're paying for it, and yet there's really no consequences. They're just constantly living under this oppressive state. In fact, that's human history for the past thousands of years, is people living under very oppressive governments, right? So to have this system of freedom, of free discourse, of prosperity is a aberration in the course of human history. So that's why I think it's so important that those in power need to be informed and need to really uphold these principles, because because we've given them the power to rule over us in this sense, and they could take us back to a period of suffering and of stagnation, or they can take us forward, right? So I think that's why, like, one, public opinion is very important in the sense that we need to be disseminating good information, we need to be having free discourse. But yeah, like if you can't change the system, short of maybe like starting your own medical practice system, right, just basically flagrantly violating the laws in open defiance, then they've actually done it to themselves, right? If the Canadian medical system basically has a civil war, that's on them. And maybe that might be the solution. Obviously, I hope it all gets resolved peacefully and without the need to start, this extra legislative action. But that's why I think,
without many more lives being lost.
Yeah. And I guess I can relate it to the criminal justice system back here in the US, in the sense that, it's very broken. That's why we had so many protests. There's a lot of, I spent an hour talking about like how broken it is. And so that's why some of my colleagues are basically in favor of non-policy reforms to combating it. So like basically, like we need to basically throw a wrench in the entire system, in the sense that he's in favor of just giving a ton of resources to people that are, going to court so they can fight back with their own legal resources. So instead of like trying to reform the system from the inside, just straight up just throwing monkey wrenches into it, right? So like that's where we've come to, in the sense that the system has gotten so broken, we cannot change it. But obviously we're not doing violence or anything. We're just like, we know that what we're doing is going to cause a lot of problems, and we're hoping those problems basically make them think twice about what they're doing. So that's basically kind of where we're at. And that's why I'm not too optimistic, in the sense that even in a democracy, systems can become so corrupted, so broken. You're going to have to start resorting to non-policy reforms, like causing actual trouble. Like obviously we're not causing real, we're just in favor of giving defendants lots of resources to fight back, which would then like cause lots of problems on their end. But yeah, this is what we've come to, right? And this is why I hope, and the CPSO and other Canadian licensing bodies understand that if something bad happens, if the Canadian medical system breaks because of, doctors start fighting back in these like peaceful but also disruptive ways, that is on them. And they're doing a disservice to the Canadian people. Like if people start dying more because their doctors are out, like, the system's amok, that is their fault. And that's why I'm very concerned.
It's just so draconian, and it's done with such arrogance, You mentioned the word corruption, Ethan. So how much do you think corruption is involved here in these medical governing bodies? I spoke to another lawyer about this who has extensive experience with various provincial governing bodies in medicine, and he had a lot to say. And I'll be probably speaking with him again online in an interview, public interview. But how much do you think corruption is involved? Do they even see it as corruption? Do these members even see it? I mean, when you're listening to this meeting firing Dr. Francis Christian, which I know you've heard, in the Orwellian tone, it's like, do they really even believe what they're saying? And if they do, that's even scarier than if they don't. You know what I mean? In some ways. So how much is corruption playing a role here? And then part B, the average person believes that there's a lot of corruption in judicial corruption, judges, lawyers, but more so, people that make the decisions, that make the rulings. What's your take on that? And this is why perhaps I'm feeling so pessimistic, because the US Supreme Court even has made some determinations and refused certain cases where, I'm no legal expert, but it's like, wait a minute, wouldn't we be better off hearing this? Like, why did you not want to hear this? What's your whole take on the concept of corruption, not only in the medical legal bodies, but in the whole legal process?
I guess when it comes to corruption, I haven't been looking. Obviously I don't know much about the Canadian medical system and how corrupt it is, nor do I know how corrupt the U.S. legal system is. But I think there's always some corruption at play. Well, I like to place most of the blame on really the ideology and the way people think about, because I think altruism is probably one of the greatest the greatest evils, basically, when it comes to this kind of stuff. Not like doing nice things for people, but altruism in the sense that I know what's best for other people, and therefore I will impose it on you, right? So that's always people might freak out. There's probably this very economic way of thinking, like a lot of economists hate altruism, mostly the way I explained it, not like the way doing nice things for people kind of way. So in the sense, that's why I believe where I believe that a lot of the physicians in Canada who are controlling the state bodies and the CPSO and whatnot, I think they really do believe, they also based on their rhetoric, people actually believe that if you protest lockdowns or you like don't do this or that, people are going to die, right? So they've talked themselves into this hyper altruism in the sense that I care so much about society that I'm willing to bend the rules, I'm willing to step on people who stand in my way. But at the end of the day, I think I'm doing so much good for society, right? They're blinded by this fervor, and it's this misled fervor to cleanse, essentially, to basically, they think that we shut up the right people, the rules will work, the lockdowns will work, they'll act like everything's going to work. And the reason why nothing's working is because we have these people who are outside protesting against lockdowns, right? We hear this in the US all the time. And they even got really, I think politicians are all really bad at hiding their, when it comes to hiding this stuff. I know a lot of politicians, they said that these anti-lockdown protests are spreading the virus. But then there's a lot of, Black Lives Matter starts protesting and people are out doing the same thing. And they're saying, no, like that doesn't spread the virus. So I think the politicians are really bad at hiding it.
Yeah.
But so I think it's a mix of, especially in the medical community and maybe the political community as well, this hyper altruism in the sense that I just know what's so best for society. And I'm willing to stamp out people who don't agree with me. But I think especially in the political side, people do have agendas, and obviously there's a lot of incentives to explain why the agenda means more than what's right. Obviously there's like, you want your side to win. You don't want the other side's like theory or idea to win. So that's why I think politics really mucks it up. But I think mostly in the medical community, there is this hyper sense of altruism, and that makes them disregard the principles that allow free discourse, disagreements, and whatnot.
That's kind of a nice way of putting it, and the use of the word altruism that I hadn't anticipated. I would just say it's about telling people what to do.
Yeah.
And I think wokeism has something to do with it, and that's certainly, we can talk about that some other time. Ethan, is there anything else you would like to talk to with regards to everything we've been talking about, whether it's the direct censorship of Canadian physicians in your article or anything that we've touched on here today? I would love to hear more from you, but I'm gonna wrap this up here very shortly.
Yeah, of course. I mean, I don't have anything too pressing on my mind. I guess I can wrap up by saying that public opinion and influencing it, getting out messages are so important, especially because you cannot rely at the people at the top to do the right thing. Sometimes it's up to the people at the bottom, people in civil society, people in institutions with influence, to really put out the narratives that counteract, what's prevailing, right? To put out the correct information, to disagree in public, and also to show people that the end is not here, right? There can be hope, to be brave in front when everyone's afraid. And so if you're the first one over those ramparts, you'd be very surprised about how many people will follow for, right? And so I think that's the most important thing for me is like one public opinion is probably one of the most influential things in a democracy, and we still have our democracy. So let's make sure we keep it.
Wow. On that note, Eric, I want to thank you on behalf of our viewers in the Toronto Business Journal for joining us here today, ladies and gentlemen. Eric Yang, Research Fellow for the American Institute of Economic Research. I want to wish you luck on your doctorate of jurisprudence as well. You gave a wonderful interview today, and you gave us a lot to think about. And there's some hope there. There really is. And so I'm really glad I spoke with you today, and would love to catch up with you again in the future. Maybe we'd have an update when certain things unfold. But on behalf of myself and the Toronto Business Journal, Eric Young, thank you so much for speaking to us and our viewers today.
It's been a pleasure to be here.
Take care of yourself, Eric.
Thank you.